The following is an OPB original series.
Oregon Experience is a production of OPB in partnership with the Oregon Historical Society. Leading support for Oregon Experience is provided by the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation, Arlene Schnitzer and Jordan Schnitzer. Major support provided by the Clark Foundation. Additional support provided by the Holzman Foundation, the Roundhouse Foundation, the contributing members of OPB, and viewers like you. Thank you.
In the Pacific Northwest, it was animal pelts that was the gold that brought people out here.
The Hudson's Bay Company was an enormous fur trade operation and a very visible presence for Great Britain and its interest here in this new land.
McLoughlin's dilemma as the Oregon Trail is opening up is what to do with the Americans.
He could obey the company to the letter of the law, close the doors to this fort, and basically let them starve.
He understands that desperate people in desperate times do desperate things.
It's a little bit hard when you look out on that landscape to see what was here, which was these large Wapato ponds and flats and lakes.
We had camas, and we had berries from the mountain. We had deer and elk. We had salmon. We had smelt.
It was an incredibly wealthy place. We had the ability to amass real quantities of goods that then we traded.
You were at the crossroads of the known world, in a world where trade was really most important.
For thousands of years, Native people viewed this place as an important nexus for resources and trade.
It was a very highly populated area, one of the most populated areas in the country, with over 30 different tribal groups here. It was a sophisticated hunter-gatherer society. They lived here, if not most of the year, year-round, and villages in the thousands. It was also a very sophisticated trade network that was occurring here. And so the I-5 of the time, or the interstate of the time, was the Columbia River.
This area that we're in right now is really one of our primary prairies that we took care of through burning of the grasses.
Our ancestors, we burned for many, many different reasons. Everything from creating good forage habitat for hunting, for actual planting of traditional foods. And so a whole series of prairies was created on the north shore of the Columbia River. And one of those prairies was selected to be Fort Vancouver.
The plain that the Native people cleared was very attractive to outsiders, especially to those engaged in the burgeoning fur trade.
Animal pelts were very valuable in places like the Far East and in London and Europe. And the most valuable pelt was the beaver pelt because it had a special characteristics that made a felt that was very good for gentlemen's hats. And so that was the gold that brought people out to the Pacific Northwest. Those beaver hats were incredibly valuable. They were like having a Rolex watch today. It was a status symbol. And people would come 18,000 miles by sailing ship around the tip of South America through the Hawaiian Islands and wind up here just to acquire those animal pelts. It's really quite extraordinary.
The organization most prominent in this lucrative enterprise was the Hudson's Bay Company. In its heyday, this business controlled the fur trade throughout large parts of North America. In 1821, the Hudson's Bay Company was expanding into a territory they called the Columbia Department. It stretched from the Rocky Mountains to the coast, as far north as Sitka, Alaska, and as far south as present-day San Francisco. Appointed to head this department, become its chief factor, was a man named John McLoughlin. He would build and run the trading depot at Fort Vancouver, the hub of the Columbia Department.
His direction was simple. It was make money for the company and create a clear presence, a very visible presence for Great Britain and its interest here in this new land. John McLoughlin was an individual very strong-willed, bright, certainly a leader, also impetuous and quick to temper. He was also known for being fair-minded, and while a savvy businessman, he certainly also was known for being moral.
But McLaughlin's role transcended mere business. The position of chief factor also had political implications.
He is literally the law and the rule of the land for the British Empire. The Hudson's Bay Company is a royal chartered company. So they're really operating under the auspices of the monarchy of Great Britain. They are a force of British colonialism as well. They're colonizing while they're also making a profit.
In the early 1800s, the United States and Great Britain had conflicting claims to a large piece of the Columbia Department. Eventually, the two countries reached a vague and uneasy accord. They agreed to share commercial rights and allow free settlement of the area. But in truth, the Hudson's Bay Company held a virtual monopoly on trade and was the de facto power in the region. A struggle for the total control of this territory would continue for decades to come. In the 1820s, the Hudson's Bay Company Governor-in-Chief, George Simpson, wanted to solidify the British advantage. Simpson was clear with McLoughlin: discourage Americans from settling in the territory. But throughout his tenure at the fort, McLoughlin would strive to maintain harmony with Americans.
Situated as we ought to say nothing about the boundary question, as that is an affair of the government, but live in Christian peace and concord. The country is not worth going to war over.
Here at Fort Vancouver, this fort with this palisade wall, it had many different functions, but one of the primary functions was the company had gentlemen employees and they had servant employees. Only gentlemen and their families were allowed to reside inside the fort. And the servants resided in a village which was a quarter-mile to the west from here. So social class here is really defined based upon where you live, if you're inside versus outside these fort walls. All the gentlemen of the company had a daily meal here in the chief factor's house, in the central dining hall, where you were required to actually come. They would discuss business. This really was the political center point, really, of the Oregon country during this time period. Almost every pivotal decision that the British fur trade made during this time period was made really in the dining hall here at the chief factor's house.
Outside the walls of the fort, in the nearby village, another, far more complex community existed. The world of the engagés. These were people with a wide variety of skills who hailed from diverse backgrounds.
The engagés were essentially the working class, so that everybody that worked for the company that was not a gentleman living in the fort was an engagé. So it included the people in the canoes, the fur trappers, the people working the mill. the common laborers. All of them were engagés, and predominantly those engagés lived in the village and had their families there.
We have Englishmen, we have Scots, we have Orkney Islanders, we have French Canadians, we have Métis, who are usually half French Canadian, half Native American. We have almost every tribe you can think of in the Pacific Northwest, from the Chinuk down to the Umpqua. And then we have Algonquians and Iroquois here, and we have Native Hawaiian Islanders.
The connection with Hawaii is really one of the more interesting parts of the Fort Vancouver story. All of the trading ships that would come from England would go through the Hawaiian Islands on their way here to refit and refurbish, but also there was a need for labor to help out with fur trapping as well as all the other things going on at the fort. And Native Hawaiians had been part of the fur business for probably a decade or two before Fort Vancouver was established.
The company actually employed over 2,000 Native Hawaiian Islanders because they had a trade station on Oahu, and they had a formal relationship with the monarchy in Hawaii, and were bringing Hawaiians here.
They were typically young, strong, single men. They came here, some for adventure, some for the opportunity. When you think of the influence and the manpower they brought, they were critically important to the successful operation of the business here.
Despite their important role, life at the fort for the Hawaiians, as with all engagés, could be restrictive and difficult.
They weren't allowed to have land, and a lot of Hawaiians went into debt with buying warm clothes and buying things that they needed from the company store. Life here was very hard for the Hawaiians, but it was hard for pretty much most people who lived here.
All of the Hawaiian workers as well as the engagés lived in the village, and their duties were 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset. On Sunday, it was a day of rest, but if you think about it, they were responsible for building their own homes, the caring for their family, making sure they have enough food. The workers were provided a salary and some clothing, but for the most part, that wasn't enough for themselves, much less for their families.
You were engaged with the Hudson's Bay Company. You wrote a contract which was typically for 3 years. You could not quit during those 3 years. If you left your service before your service was up, they called you a deserter. And so they would send an armed party to go after you. And their punishment was to strap them to a cannon in front of the chief factor's house and bring all the employees together, and they would lash them. Usually it was 20 lashes. So it was a group punishment and demonstration of the power of the company, saying, do not desert, because this is what is going to happen to you.
In this multicultural world, marriage between Native women and company men was quite common. Nearly all of the men, both officers and engagés, were married to Indian or mixed-race wives.
These unions were not formal or civil or religious as we might have thought, but they were incredibly important. These women helped create a sense of community, so they were stabilizing forces. Native women and Métis women served as translators, guides. And these Native women were women of stature. I think a lot of people don't realize they were women who were the daughters or the sisters to tribal leaders. They were powerful women, and they had a foot in both worlds. With regard to the Métis women, they would help set up or break down camps. They would do the cooking, they would prepare the clothing, they would gather the firewood. The success of the fur trade was greatly dependent on Native women and Métis women. Those women were indispensable.
But not everyone understood or accepted these unions. As missionaries arrived from the Oregon Trail, discrimination against these women became more prevalent. Not even McLoughlin's wife Marguerite, of Native and Swiss ancestry, was exempt from this prejudice.
There was the story of Reverend Herbert Beaver, who spoke of Marguerite as a woman of notoriously loose character, as a kept mistress to John McLoughlin. And so upon learning what the Reverend Beaver was saying about his wife, he took Reverend Beaver's cane and hit him on the head and shoulders. John McLoughlin required that his wife, Marguerite, be treated with respect and dignity.
In the 19th century, other people crucial to the fur trade were the Voyagers. These French Canadians moved animal pelts to and from trading posts like Fort Vancouver.
The Voyagers were the quintessential outdoorsmen of the past. They would come back with canoes filled with animal pelts they were bringing back, and when they got close to the fort, they would change into their finest regalia and ribbons and colorful sashes and colorful hats, and they would come singing canoe songs.
When the trappers first come in here from Hudson's Bay, most of them were French, but these were people that also understood rain and sun and animal life. Now, furs were valuable because there was a demand for that, but they understood how one goes about to get them. So these are people that were pretty savvy about earth connections.
They were essentially camping, canoeing. Their entire life was pretty much outdoors. In many cases, they've intermarried with indigenous people, and their children were called Métis.
So when these people came in, they were people who were part of our lifestyle as Indian people. It didn't matter the color of their skin because they lived with us and they worked with us.
Speaking more than one language was commonplace in the Columbia Department. Governor George Simpson noted this on a canoe trip in the region.
It is the prettiest congregation of nations, the nicest confusion of tongues that has ever taken place since the days of the Tower of Babel.
Tiki-skeen, tiki-skeen, tiki-skeen.
But unlike Babel, linguistic confusion at Fort Vancouver was kept to a minimum. That's because everyone had something in common. A jargon based on the Chinuk language, but peppered with influences from many other tribes and countries.
There's this reduced form of Chinuk that's called Chinuk Wawa that at one time many people in the Pacific Northwest knew. But it really was a pidgin language, meaning that it was just used by adults who needed bare bones communication. Then there's children being raised with Chinuk Wawa as a common language. Those kids always had their parents' languages. So it could be Hawaiian and Scottish, it could be Chinook and whatever, right? These kids were getting raised in those situations and they were taking the language and creolizing it. So the language went from this bare bones communication language to a full-blown language that could say and do anything. Kanchi Boston Tillicum, Cheatlaska O Kabuguk and Saika Ilai, Beatlas Wawa, Tiki Skeen, and Saga Gumducks, Saga Flush Gumducks, Codipus, Iskam, Skeen, Kagwood, Sladwa, Gaba Ilai, Be Iskam. Being Saika Hui, Kabuk Chi, Boston, Tillicum, Kabuk Chi Chagu, Wigna, Kabuk Tillicum, Chi Chagu, Kaban Saika Ilai.
Disease had always been one of the most terrible outcomes of contact for Native people. Those who lived near Fort Vancouver suffered unimaginable loss.
Between 1750 and 1850, about 98% of all the people died. And that is immense. It's immense for its impact that it had on not only native societies, but also what early settlers were interfacing with. These were not tribes that were at the height of their strength.
In 1829, the fever and ague first came, and it came every summer for a number of years after that. Fever and ague, we believe, was probably malaria, and it had a devastating impact on the local indigenous tribes all up and down the lower Columbia region.
There's whole areas that aren't occupied. Villages have collapsed down on one another.
There were entire villages that were completely wiped out where people canoed by and saw just bodies on the beaches. Many of the people in the fort also became sick, but they had quinine and they had other treatments that were more effective. There wasn't enough medicine for everyone, and so they think that some of the people just came to the fort because they knew that somebody would take care of their body when they died.
In 1843, the first American wagon train arrived in Oregon country. Close to 1,000 people, many of them destitute and near starvation. John McLoughlin faced a growing dilemma.
He could obey the company to the letter of the law, close the doors to this fort, and basically let them starve. But I think he knew deep down, this was just the tip of the spear of the immigration. More are gonna come. And this was 1,000. He had 200 employees. So if next year 2,000 or 3,000 show up and they learn that 1,000 Americans were left to die of starvation, they were not gonna be very happy.
He understands that if I don't do business with the settlers, desperate people in desperate times do desperate things. They may storm the fort, they may take what they need in order to survive. But I also think you get back to that sense, I think he was a moral man, and he felt an obligation to help the settlers.
In a dramatic move, McLoughlin extended $35,000 in credit to the new arrivals, with little expectation of being repaid.
What else could I do as a man having a spark of humanity in my nature? I did not invite the Americans to come. To be frank, I greatly regretted their coming. But they did come, covered with the dust of travel, worn out by fatigue, hardships, and dangers. They came without food or raiment. I fed them and clothed them.
The Hudson's Bay Company back in London did not agree with his decision, and they let him know about it very vocally.
They saw that as a lost profit. And that began this severing between John McLoughlin and the Hudson's Company.
Meanwhile, presidential candidate James K. Polk was calling to expand the U.S. into the far reaches of the Columbia Department. His slogan was 5440 or fight. But Great Britain was in no mood to fight.
Great Britain had already fought 2 wars with the United States, both the Revolution and the War of 1812. They were like, we don't want to fight another costly war on the other side of the Atlantic. So really, Great Britain was putting out the peace feelers and started negotiating with the United States on how can we solve the Oregon country problem.
The Oregon Treaty of 1846 ended the dispute between the two nations, setting the border between the United States and Canada at the 49th parallel.
When news of that arrived here at Fort Vancouver in early 1847, it really caught the Hudson's Bay Company off guard because suddenly they were operating in United States territory.
The treaty allowed the Hudson's Bay Company to continue operation at Fort Vancouver. But time had run out for John McLoughlin. His rift with company executives had become irreparable.
It was pretty clear, the handwriting was on the wall, that he was going to be asked to leave. And so by 1846, he had determined that he would retire, and he moved to Oregon City, where he had land holdings, and he applied to become a citizen of the United States.
Before leaving the Hudson's Bay Company, John McLoughlin wrote his superiors a long letter in his own defense.
In acting as I have done, I firmly believe that time will prove that I have not only fulfilled the dictates of humanity, but most effectually promoted the best interests of the company.
McLoughlin would die a mostly forgotten man in 1857. But a century later, in recognition of his pivotal role in the story of this region, he would be formally named the Father of Oregon. In 1849, the United States Army arrived at the fort and rapidly set up the Vancouver Barracks. The Hudson's Bay Company would continue to do business in the area until 1860. But over time, profits were stifled by tariffs, and relations with the Army became strained.
So they gave the keys of the fort to the U.S. Army, and they said, take care of it for us. We are suing the United States government for the value of this property. So what's amazing is for 6 years, the U.S. Army managed the remnants of this fort. They weren't doing any repairs, and there's evidence that there were holes in building roofs and things like that. And then in 1866, a mysterious fire started. The newspaper recorded that the fire seemed to be in about 12 different locations at once, and 500 soldiers stood by and watched it burn. Fort Vancouver became no more, and it burned to the ground.
In the decades to follow, the barracks expanded its presence, and the city of Vancouver, Washington grew along with it. Then, in 1947, the National Park Service sent archaeologist Louis Cawood to Vancouver to search for the remains of the fort. In the ensuing years, the Park Service reconstructed Fort Vancouver on its original footprint. Archaeological work continues to this day.
For an archaeologist, being able to look at all these different time periods and to unearth items that are the tangible remains of the people that were here at Fort Vancouver is really important.
The fort's collection of artifacts numbers well over 2 million items. And each year, over 1 million people visit. The story of all those who once lived here is told anew.
This place brought so many diverse peoples of different cultures, different races, different religions, and they came here and lived fairly harmoniously together. The history here is one that is so relatable, and it ties to so many different people, and so it resonates with everyone.
There's more about Fort Vancouver on Oregon Experience online. To learn more or to order a DVD of the show, visit opb.org. Leading support for Oregon Experience is provided by the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation, Arlene Schnitzer and Jordan Schnitzer, Major support provided by the Clark Foundation. Additional support provided by the Holzman Foundation, the Roundhouse Foundation, the contributing members of OPB, and viewers like you. Thank you.